Hello everyone, welcome back to the Pottery Corner, my studio down on the south coast of England near Chichester. Hi everyone, welcome along. Today we're doing part 2 of the making of the goose jug. So if you haven't seen part 1, there's a step-by-step tutorial on the channel of how to hand build this goose jug. I'm calling it a goose jug because it kind of looks like a goose, hasn't really got a name, but that's what I'm calling it. So it's the goose jug. So from our previous video, part 1, I've now fired this piece and it's now bisque fired and it's ready for glazing. So that's what we're going to do today. So I've got all the bits and pieces out, which I'll run through with you when I've moved the camera down so that you can see, and we'll dive right in and get on with glazing this piece. Okay, so we're ready. First thing to do is to brush the bisque. I know that some people wash it off. I personally don't like washing it off because I think it fills the vessel, the bisque, with water, and then you have to dry it again. So I'm cutting out that process by using a hakey brush or hacky brush, just a soft bristled brush, just to go over my bisque to make sure that there's no dust on it. Because if there's dust on it, bisque dust on it, it will stop the glaze from holding and it will crawl. So that's the reason for taking the dust off. I mean, usually there isn't very much on there, but it's just a safety guard, just in case there is a patch of dust that stops your glaze from adhering to the actual piece. So that's the reason for doing it. I am going to actually do the whole of this piece apart from the base of the feet. So I'm just going to make sure that I've given it a good brush all over and in the next section. Okay, so that's the first stage. Other things that I have out on the table are the glazes that I've chosen, which I'll talk about in a minute, a little pot with a couple of sponges in, and my glaze brushes. Now I like to use these fan brushes. I find that they're really useful. They're just, it's personal style. As I've shown you before, I think I have a big box of glazed brushes, which the students use, but I personally tend to use the fan brushes unless I'm doing finer details. And these are actually makeup brushes that came from Poundland. So they cost £1 each instead of the £5 that you'll be charged for a fan brush from a pottery supplier. So again, trying to use things that are cheaper to actually purchase in the first place. So that's my brushes. This previous jug that we were looking at in the previous video is glazed in Amaco's Saturation Gold with Maco's Raspberry Mist in the throat. Now I do like that. I like that combination, and I've been thinking since the last video on what I want to do on this piece, and sometimes it does take a little while for me to work out what I actually want to do. So I know I should already have a plan in place when I start making, but very often that's not the case. So I've decided to go risky. Oh, risky business. So this is Amaco's Palladium, but this is Amaco's Palladium on my normal white stoneware body. So most of my test tiles are on the white stoneware body. If I'm going to use it on craft crank, this particular clay, then I do a test tile on that clay so I know what it's going to come out like. And actually it isn't very different. It's not quite as mirror shiny because obviously this white stoneware is quite nice and smooth, and the craft crank clay is quite rough, so you're not getting quite such a mirror finish. And of course the other thing about Palladium is that it runs like a devil, like an absolute devil. So this is Amaco's Palladium, PC4 for those of you that like the glaze numbers. And then this is, again, this is Maco's Raspberry Mist on my white stoneware. 3 coats, so I like to write on there how many coats that is. And then again, I've done the same glaze, so Raspberry Mist on the craft crank clay, and again, that's 3 coats. So I can see what it's going to come out like. So that's what I've chosen. I need to be aware that the Palladium runs like a devil, probably as runny, if not runnier, than seaweed. but I thought actually the sort of the shiny texture on there might actually work with this, so we'll see, won't we? Okay, so without further ado, I don't actually want this jug to be functional. It's going to be completely decorative, so I'm not going to glaze the inside of the jug. If I did want to use it functionally, then I would pour some transparent glaze from my bucket using a funnel inside, and I would swirl it round to make sure I had a good coat on the inside of this jug. But in this instance, I don't actually want this jug to be functional, so I'm just going to be glazing as far down into the neck as I can reach with my brush. Right, so a slight sort of start at the beginning glaze tutorial really. The glazes that come in these little pots are already mixed, ready to use. But sometimes if they've been sat on the shelf for a little while, there may be an element of separation in them. When I pick up a pot of glaze that I'm going to use, I always give it a really good shake. And, you know, this is a good bingo wings workout, ladies. You know, give it a good shake. It's no good just kind of flopping it around. That's not enough. You need to be much more vigorous and make sure that you've mixed up all the glaze in the pot. Everything that you want to use, all the interesting bits, will be stuck at the bottom. So I always give it a really, really good shake. You don't need to do it as you're using it, but if you give it a good shake when you start. And again with the palladium is a much looser glaze, a much thinner glaze. So again, I'm just going to give it a really good shake. Make sure that all of those glaze materials are combined inside the bottle, and do make sure your lids are on when you do this. I have had a student end up with Amaco pear all over her because the top hadn't been put on properly. Right, so that's now mixed. So I'm going to start by putting the palladium all over, and on the next section, this reveal on the spout here. Okay, so having mixed my palladium, can take the top off, which of course won't come off. There we go. Get my brush, and then I'm going to put my brush into the glaze, load my brush with glaze. Okay, so now that it's on the brush, what I don't want to do is do that and wipe it all off the brush, because there's now nothing much on the brush. So load your brush. And then I'm going to start at a convenient point, and I'm just going to lay the glaze on. So as you can see, I'm not brushing it, I'm laying it on, and I just want to let that sit there without moving it. So I'm loading my brush, going to the next section, laying the glaze on, making sure that I haven't got any gaps, that I can't actually see that bisque. Don't want to see the bisque. So if there's any holes, make sure you filled them up. So going round. So I'm not scrubbing the glaze on, I am laying the glaze on. I'm turning my brush because, of course, both sides of the brush are full of glaze. So as I'm coming up to this spout section, I'm just going to put the glaze where I want it to go. If it goes in a place I don't want it to go at this stage, I can take it off. That's why I have not put the raspberry mist on yet. Normally you would do this the other way around, but because palladium is such a runny glaze, I'm just going to be careful that I'm not going to let that drip into the mouth of the jug where I don't want it to be. So just being a little bit careful with it over there in that stage. Now this is starting to dry already. In fact, if I show you the piece that we started on here, it's drying, almost completely dry. So I've obviously got to now do underneath, but the top is still wet. So I'm just going to give that a minute just to dry off on the top, and then I can pick it up and turn it over. I can't do that at the moment because it's too wet. So I'm just going to leave that for a minute and grab my mug and have a slurp of coffee. Cheers, everybody. So as you can see, it's drying, still not dry, that first coat. So I'm just going to let that dry off a bit more before I pick it up. Right, so coffee's finished, and this is almost dry, apart from this piece around the handle and the top where that's the last piece that I've done. So there's enough of it that's dry to enable me to pick that up. So I am going to just pick it up very carefully and continue to paint underneath. And I'm going to take the glaze right the way down the feet, not onto the base of the feet, but right the way down the feet, so the whole piece is covered in glaze. I'm going to follow the direction of the brush strokes that I was doing earlier, remembering which way I have done my brush strokes, trying to keep them in one direction, making sure there are no little holes where I have missed. So I shouldn't be able to see any of that salmon pinky colour of the bisque when I have finished painting the first coat. I've also grabbed myself a piece of waffle foam so that when if I need to lay this down, I've got a piece of waffle foam to lay it on. It's okay at the moment. Right, and now I need to move it. Actually, I'm going to stand it and just let it dry for a minute again. And then I'll turn it and continue on the other side. Again, keeping my brush strokes in the same direction as the direction we went before. And filling in all the little bits as I see them. Sometimes it's difficult to see them unless you turn your piece different directions. Right. Just checking that it's completely covered, which I think it is. Just have a look under the handle. That's always a place that gets missed under here. But that's absolutely fine. That's our first coat on. So I'm just going to place that back down again. Now, I have this little system with my students where we write the coats down. So I'm just going to pop this number 1 onto the whirler because I know if I go away and do something else for 10 minutes and I come back to it, I know that there's only 1 coat on there. So when I've done the second coat, likewise, I would change that to a number 2. And then obviously, if I'm doing a third coat, that's usually my end coat. So I don't usually use the 3, but sometimes it's quite useful to just leave the 3 on there so that I know that the piece is finished and it's just waiting for me to clean the bottoms. So that's my system of how I work out the coats. And I find that system particularly useful if I'm doing lots of glazing. So I'll have the 1, the 2 and the 3. And then if I'm glazing mugs, when it's had 1 coat, I put it behind the number 1. And then when it's had 2 coats, I put it behind number 2. So if you're using multiple glazes and you've got multiple pieces, it's quite useful to know how many coats, because quite often, even if you go and answer a phone call or you pop down to the loo or something, you'll forget where you were. So it's quite a good system to use, and just have the numbers on the table and then just pop your piece behind the number of coats that you've actually done. So this is drying really quickly on the first coat because the bisque is pulling the moisture out of the glaze. So I'm just going to let that dry, because what I don't want to do, I've just noticed, I'm sure the eagle-eyed of you will have seen it, there's just a little tiny bit there of bisque showing through. What I don't want to do is put another coat on while the coat is wet, because what will happen is it will just pick up the wet glaze and spread it, and then you're not laying a layer on. You're picking up a wet layer and moving it, so you won't have the coverage. So I'm just going to let that dry for just a minute, and we'll come back in a second and carry on. Okay, so it's about 3 or 4 minutes later, and our first coat is now dry. just about. There's a couple of tiny spots on it that aren't quite dry, but that's good enough as far as I'm concerned. When I'm putting the next coat on, I want to go in a different direction to the direction that I painted the original coat. And that's so that I get an even coverage over my coats and I'm not left with streaks from painting all in one direction. So this time I'm actually going to go across the previous painting, and again I'm going to lay my glaze on. I hope you're noticing how many times I re-dip my brush, and I'm just going to paint across the previous direction on this layer so that I get a nice even covering. It's slightly difficult with the fins, and that's why I'm sort of laying it on and then slightly doing the fins as well. It's quite difficult to go across the fins. If I get a very large run, then I'm just going to sweep that off. But I want to make sure that I'm not putting it on in the same direction. So I'm going to continue with that over the whole piece. And again, I'll probably leave it to dry in the middle so that I can pick it up and move it. Right, so that's the second coat on the top. So I'm going to grab my number 2. I have actually put a tablecloth onto my worktop surface here, just a plastic tablecloth. 2 reasons for doing that. One, some of the glazes have iron oxide, red iron oxide in them, and they stain. So I don't really want them to stain my worktop table. So I always use a cloth. And the second reason is all these drips and bits and pieces that are on here, I will take off with a metal kidney and put in my glaze chips pot, my hundreds and thousands confetti glaze. So I don't waste any of this. I certainly don't wipe it up with a cloth. When it's dry, when it's been left overnight and it's dry, I'll just chip those bits off and put them into the confetti pot. Okay, so as you can see, our second coat is drying. It's nearly dry. It takes longer, obviously, on a second coat to dry because the bisque is now starting to get much more saturated with moisture, so it's not pulling the second coat of the glaze drying out quite so much. Now I've got the bottom of this to do, so I'm just going to be careful again how I tip it over. Now I can see from the wet glaze where I got to, so I can continue putting on the second coat just down on this bottom section here. Again, making sure that I keep my brush strokes in the opposite direction to the direction that we put the first coat on. I know where I got to. You can kind of see from this section here where the glaze is still very slightly wet. So I'm going to do this foot all the way around, continue across the base, under the tail. I need to turn this now. Right, so that's coat number 2. And again, I'm just going to pop that down again with his number 2 marker and leave that to dry. Right, okay, so our coat number 2 is now dry, so it's time for coat number 3. Obviously this is palladium, and as I said at the beginning, it's a very drippy glaze. So I'm going to put a third coat on, but I probably won't take a much down onto the feet, because obviously it's going to come down the body of the jug and down onto the feet. So if I put a third coat on the feet, I'm just going to have glaze running everywhere. So this particular coat, I'm just going to probably bring it down onto the feet, but not right the way over the feet. And just watch what I'm putting on this bottom section, because everything is going to slide from the top down to this bottom section, so it won't need as much glaze on the bottom. So I'm just going to quickly put this third one on. I'll speed the camera up so that you're not watching that. And again, I'm just going to be mindful of the direction that I am applying the glaze in. So we've obviously been down and we've been across. So this time I'm just going to take my brush strokes in a slightly different direction. I mean, obviously it won't matter quite so much on this third layer, but I am just being mindful that I need to make sure that that glaze is not being applied in lines. Right, okay, that's my third coat done. This is going to take a while to dry because obviously it is now much thicker. That is my number 3, which I've managed to slop glaze all over, but I'll leave it there so that I know what it is. I actually have not done anything actually on the base this time, and I have just taken it down onto the feet but not down the feet. So that's now ready to dry. In terms of the mouth section, I have done the palladium where I want it to be, and it hasn't dripped anywhere, but had it done so I could just take it off with a sponge. I'm going to leave the palladium to dry completely, and then I'll put the raspberry mist in the throat of this pour, and we'll come back and I'll show you that. Okay, so we're back. That's our third coat, so we know that's our last one on there. It's all nice and dry now, as you can see. So I just need to do the glazing in the neck. I could use one of my fan brushes. I could choose to use a smaller brush. So we'll see how we go. I'll just give the raspberry mist a little shake because it's been a little while since we picked it up. See if I can get the top off. Yep. Okay. And then I'm going to use 3 coats of raspberry mist in this throat of this jug. As I said earlier, I don't need it to be functional, but I am being careful where I'm putting the glaze because obviously I don't really want it to go over the palladium. It doesn't really matter if it does, but I'm just going to be a little bit careful. Try and get my brush down as far as I can see where the glaze would be in that neck. As I said, it doesn't need to be functional, but obviously aesthetically I just want to make sure that it's covered. I hope you're catching this. Sometimes it's difficult to do it backwards. Right, so that's our coat 1. So I'm just going to put number 1 on there. So I know that's coat 1, and again we'll leave that to dry and then I'll do the other 2 coats. Right, so there we are. We have 3 coats of raspberry mist in the throat of the jug. So that's now finished glazing. I will just have to wipe off any glaze that's on the feet. So as you can see, there is a little bit on there. So I'm just going to take that off with a damp sponge, just a little bit. I don't want this to stick to the cookies that I will put it on in the kiln, so I need to just make sure that those feet are clean. So let's just take that off of there. Normally I would say that I would take the glaze up the foot a little way, but I'm going to show you how I'm going to put this in the kiln, so you'll see how I'm going to actually make sure that this palladium doesn't stick to anything. So first of all, I just need to make sure that there's no palladium actually on the feet, so they're nice and clean. So that's now ready to sit downstairs on the kiln shelf, and I'll take you along with me when I pack it into the kiln, and then we'll see it come out of the kiln and finished. So I hope that's given you some pointers to glazing. If you enjoy my tutorials, don't forget to hit the subscribe button because there's always new content coming out every week. Right, so we're down in the kiln room and we're ready to pack the kiln, and I've worked out how I'm going to stilt this piece in the kiln bearing in mind that it's got palladium on it. So before I start actually putting things into the kiln, the first thing that I do is I hoover out my kiln just to make sure that there are no dust particles inside the kiln for the firing, because if there were, they would be blown around in the kiln and stick onto work. So I'm just going to give it a quick hoover, and then we're going to go ahead and pop the piece in the kiln. Right, so that's all nice and clean. So I always start loading the kiln, putting the props in so that I know what load area I've actually got. So I start with my 3 props in a triangular shape, basically because then I know what I've got space-wise that I can use. Okay, right, so I've worked out how I want to stilt this. So I'm using, I'll show you, I keep anything that gets broken in the bisque firing. If anything should happen to break, then I use the pieces of bisque as cookies. So this particular dish had a crack in it when it was fired many moons ago, and I've actually used it several times, both in pieces and as one piece. So that's going to go underneath the whole of the jug just to catch any drips in case they drip off of the sides. And then each foot is going to be sat on a little series of cookies. So I have these really tiny stars. They were left over from somebody's project. I never throw anything away. So I'm going to use a tiny star. And then this again was something that one of the girls made and it didn't get used. And then this is just an ordinary cookie. So what I'm going to do is actually build up this little stack of cookies under each foot. I hope you can see those. So under each foot. So I'm going to pop them onto this thing, and I'll move the camera closer so that you can see it when it's actually standing on all of those bits. Okay, so I hope you can see each foot is sat on a star and then on the little round cookie and then on the square cookie right the way round. And then if I need to Dremel, then hopefully the only part of the dremeling that I'll need to do will be on the star. So I'm going to transfer this whole thing on its cookies and everything into the kiln, and I'll show you when it's in. Right, okay, so it's in the kiln. I've put it up against the side of the kiln, and you can kind of see it stood on its little cookies and everything ready to be fired, and that is stable there. I may have to move this prop out just a little bit, but I've got some bits and pieces that are waiting to be packed into the kiln. So there it is. Wish it well, pray to the kiln gods, and we'll see what happens when it comes out of the firing. Right, so the exciting part, finding out what's happened in the firing. So I've taken everything else out of the kiln, and there will be a kiln opening video to watch these items that are out on the side coming out of the kiln, but I've left the goose jug in the bottom so that you can actually see this coming out of the kiln. So here we go. I'm actually going to take the camera and put it in so that you can see what it looks like sitting in there. Okay. So as you can see, we have had some dripping of the palladium as expected. So when I take this out, we shall see what sort of a mess it's made of the bottom of the legs. So, big reveal. It's very shiny. It's a little bit warm, so I'm just being a little bit careful with it. Now, you can see from the cookie that was underneath it that there has been some dripping. That's exactly the reason why I used them, because, you know, palladium's a nasty drippy glaze and we don't want it all over the kiln shelf. Now, we've got quite a lot of glaze run off on this foot here, and obviously again on this foot here, and on the back you can see that it's actually come right the way down onto that cookie again. So I'm just going to spend a minute just knocking these bits and pieces off, and then we can see where we got to. Right, okay, so if you remember when we packed this kiln, we used this little flower cookie, and then we used a star cookie actually on the underneath the foot. That one is still there, as you can see. The others have been completely sacrificial, so that's come off of the other foot. And you can't see that star cookie at all because it's covered in glaze. But luckily for me, there's a little bit of dremeling to do on this foot where the star has just caught. But actually, apart from a tidy up, I'm quite pleased with that. That's actually worked quite well. There is a large glazed drip here, if you can see it. So obviously, as I was saying, the palladium will roll down the side and literally come down underneath the jug. But I don't think that it detracts from the jug. The palladium is very, very shiny, as I say. It's quite modern looking, so on an ancient pot it has that sort of juxtaposition, which I quite like. The throat is quite nice, so this is the Amaco Raspberry Mist that we used. And yeah, it's come out really nicely. So that is the finished piece, the finished goose jug. So thank you for joining me on this two-part tutorial of how to make a goose jug. Hope you've enjoyed it. Drop me a comment, let me know. There are always new tutorial videos on the channel, so subscribe and catch up with all the things that are going on here at the Pottery Corner. And I'll see you all on the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.